Hello, welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this UKLFI Charitable Trust webinar on lawfare. Karl von Clausewitz is perhaps most famous for the quote, "War is the continuation of politics by other means." And today, the same might be said of lawfare. And as the Jew among the nations, the State of Israel is increasingly the direct or indirect target of numerous lawfare initiatives. Allegations of war crimes and genocide, proposals to recognize a Palestinian state. Having failed to destroy the Zionist entity by warfare and boycotts, Israel's enemies are increasingly resorting to lawfare to further that very same objective. To properly understand this phenomenon and how best to address it, it is important first to situate it in its historical and political context and to analyse the role of lawfare by forces that oppose the West in the history of war since World War II, not just in Israel, but around the world, and to appreciate the role of law and lawfare in the international system. To help us understand this context, I'm delighted to introduce Douglas Feith. He is a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute and a former professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service, a distinguished visiting fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution, and a visiting scholar at Harvard's Kennedy School. As US Undersecretary of State for Defense for Policy from 2000 to 2001, he helped devise the strategy for the war on terrorism. He served in both the Reagan and Bush administrations, working at the White House on Middle East policy for the National Security Council, and then serving as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Negotiations Policy. Before going into the George W. Bush administration, Doug headed a law firm in Washington, and he holds degrees with honors from Georgetown University Law Center and Harvard College. He is the author also of the memoir Law and Decision: Inside the Pentagon at the Dawn of the War on Terrorism. Doug, thank you so much for joining us. This is a particularly pertinent period of history that we are living through at the moment. I'm excited to have this discussion with you in the first instance. I'm going to invite our audience to put their questions into the Q&A facility, and we'll draw on those in the second part of our conversation. But I think we're extremely privileged to have not only a lawyer, but someone who has had a front row seat to so much of these developments in the lawfare arena, perhaps before many people outside of those respective bubbles of politics and law and international relations really knew that this phenomenon existed. We have a list of legal concepts being used as ammunition against Israel. Can I perhaps start with a big question? Where do you see this phenomenon having emanated from? Can we pinpoint its origin somewhere?
I think that the uh, idea that that enemies of Western liberal democracies can use the commitment to liberalism and democracy of their enemies uh, to to hurt them is really the origin. And I think that in many ways the first really major success was the of this kind of asymmetric warfare was the anti-Vietnam War movement in the United States, where America's enemies in Vietnam were able to persuade the the U.S. Congress eventually to cut off money for the war. And so a force that was smaller and weaker than the United States was able to defeat the United States by political means, an element of which were warfare, lawfare kinds of arguments.
It's interesting to start with this particular example because, of course, we're looking at public opinion internally within a democracy which has shifted, and we saw a significant campaign within the United States against the Vietnam War. What were the lawfare related arguments that you recall from that particular phenomenon?
Well, I'm not sure that the lawfare aspects were the most dominant aspects, but they were an element. The point I think that is particularly important is this point about asymmetric warfare. The the United States and Israel right now are the two most active militaries in the Western world. Each in its sphere, the United States globally and Israel regionally, effectively is unchallengeable. There's obviously an issue between the United States and China. So, with the possible exception of China, the United States is unchallengeable in that there are not countries around the world that can have a high chance of defeating the U.S. military. And Israel is similarly situated. There, none of its enemies in the Middle East can count on defeating the Israel Defense Forces. That doesn't mean they don't conduct war against us, and it doesn't mean that they can't win wars against us. And the way they do it is through what are known as asymmetric strategies. They're not directly trying to defeat our armies. They are trying to have major political effects on us without having to defeat our militaries. And that, I think, is the key concept, partly because the Vietnamese, who were weaker than the United States and couldn't defeat the US Army, were able to defeat the United States in Vietnam by essentially political manipulation of politics to get their victory rather than defeat of our army to get their victory. And both the United States and Israel face similar asymmetric threats and have over the last half century.
It doesn't seem to be a coincidence that the chief targets of lawfare initiatives, or even the sort of ideological warfare initiatives, are clearly those Western liberal democracies that seem to prize rule of law. Is that commitment to rule of law something that you see as critical to this process being successful?
I think it is because the strategy that our enemies are pursuing is to exploit the respect for law that countries that have a rule of law feel. We have populations that for whom arguments about what is legal are powerful. They translate into action, um, into real political power. And so our enemies, who by and large are actors who have no respect for law, they don't respect international law, they don't respect their own domestic laws. Um, our enemies know that if they formulate political arguments that are legal in nature, they will immediately get a response and sympathy and support from people in rule of law countries. Because in rule of law countries, the publics and opinion leaders, politicians, journalists, and others, academics, have a well-grounded reverence for law. And that's why our enemies understand how valuable it is for them to formulate their arguments in legal terms, even though they themselves show nothing but contempt for law.
So perhaps just to drill down a little into the context that has brought much of the audience I anticipate together and what we've witnessed since the 7th of October, fully appreciate that the initial attempts to combat Israel militarily over the decades failed, conventionally that is, with missiles. Israel was also able to successfully combat that. Then the Arab League boycotts really began. That wasn't successful in eradicating Israel. So, in that context, to understand the approach and attempt of those fighting Israel on this seven front war that we've heard so much about, their whole network ultimately in the last 22 months, rather than being to defeat the IDF and overrun Israel, seems to have been aimed at something somewhat different. And one wonders if they have, in fact, been quite successful, looking at the way that the international community has shifted and arguments about Israel's right to defend itself seem to have shifted. And that is focused on seizing Israeli hostages and forcing Israel to defend themselves in an unprecedented urban warfare environment. Can you draw out from this, I suppose, unprecedented manner of waging warfare, perhaps what the key objectives might be, and what's the link between those kinetic actions and the lawfare initiatives that we've seen really, snowball in the last 22 months?
Well, you're highlighting this extremely interesting question of the essence of Hamas's strategy against Israel. And Hamas understood from the beginning that it didn't have the ability to defeat the IDF in a military confrontation. And the strategy that Sinwar developed over a number of years, a decade or so, was that he would be in a position to attack Israel, to grab hostages, to provoke and require an Israeli response, and to set things up in such a way that Israel would not be able to defend itself and would not be able to attack Hamas without substantial damage being done to Palestinian civilians. And that is an important part of understanding this enormous investment that Hamas made in its tunnel network in Gaza. It was a network that served several purposes. It served as a place where they could take and hold Israeli hostages. It served as a place which would be defensive for the Hamas fighters, but it also served as a guarantee that there would be enormous harm to the civilian infrastructure and perhaps civilians themselves among the residents of Gaza if Israel ever needed to take military action to defend itself against Hamas. Now, it's worth pausing for a moment to reflect on something that I think is unique in the history of war. And that is, there are many examples in the history of war of mass killings of civilians. And, from Genghis Khan through Adolf Hitler, there have been countries that have become notorious and leaders who've become notorious for the mass killing of civilians. There's also a well-known strategy of human shields where fighters hide behind civilians in the hopes that their enemies will not shoot at them because the enemies will be restrained by concern for what will happen to the human shields. It's important to understand that is not what's going on with Hamas. Hamas is not pursuing a human shield strategy. Hamas is pursuing a strategy of maximizing civilian casualties on its own side. That's not a human shield strategy. The purpose of a human shield strategy is not to kill the human shields. The purpose of the human shield strategy is to deter your enemy from attacking you because you're hiding behind civilians. Hamas wanted to ensure that Israel would attack, would be forced to attack because of the October 7th assault. And they wanted to ensure that there would be large Palestinian casualties because it was by publicizing the large Palestinian casualties and then working to blame those casualties on Israel rather than on Hamas, which provoked the attack and ensured that the civilian infrastructure would have to be destroyed in order to get to the tunnels. That was the essence of Hamas's strategy, was to maximize those civilian casualties and then blame Israel and then use the outrage against Israel for two main purposes. One is to try to get a major uprising by Arabs and Muslims throughout the Middle East. And they've by and large failed on that. And the other was to try to get audiences throughout the world, especially in the Western world, to react with horror and condemnation and maybe sanctions against Israel. And that has been so far a successful strategy for Hamas.
Yeah.
And but I think the idea of recognizing that what Hamas did here was new and innovative and creative in, I would say, the worst sense of all those terms, that's worth paying attention to. The purposeful the purposeful maximization of civilian casualties on their own side. And I
Yeah.
don't think there's another example of that in the history of war.
So I'm going to break with tradition, if you'll allow me, and actually start introducing some of the audience questions much earlier than I otherwise would, because one here it strikes me as particularly pertinent to what you've just described of Hamas's strategy. And it's, if lawfare is conducted as an asymmetric strategy, why does its success depend on so much misinformation, false narratives, and twisted use of legal concepts that the public and some international courts accept? Because it strikes me that much of the narrative, which I think you've correctly identified, Hamas is seeking to draw out through its approach to this kinetic war against Israel, has actually required false reports, fake pictures of very ill children being presented as the consequence of alleged Israeli starvation, or inflated casualty figures. So how do you match what seems perhaps to have originated in the context of asymmetric warfare with the situation here, which seems to rely on so much actual propaganda, fake news, if you will?
Well, I think that what Hamas cares about is persuading large parts of the world that Israel is to blame for grievous Palestinian civilian suffering. They're they're happy to do this and to pursue this honestly or dishonestly. And so when there are buildings that Israel destroys because it has to destroy them in order to destroy the tunnels underneath them,
Mm.
um, they're happy to show foreign press the photographs or have them visit the sites of destruction. In some cases, what they're showing is is real destruction, and real destruction caused by Israeli military operations. Now, Hamas will not point things out like the Israelis warned people in the building that they were going to attack the building so that the building could be evacuated beforehand, and that Israel takes other measures that aim at minimizing the the damage to Palestinian civilians. And in fact, the measures that it takes endanger its own troops because they have to signal, for example, where they're going to hit before they do so in order to get the Gazan civilians to leave. So, but in some cases, they're showing a real thing. This is a building, it was destroyed by Israel, and it was an apartment building, right? In other cases, they do dishonest things. For example, when there was a rocket fired by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, another Gazan terrorist organization working in partnership with Hamas. When there was a rocket fired by the Palestinian Islamic Jihad toward Israel that failed, and the failed rocket hit near a hospital in Gaza and killed a number of people. The Hamas officials immediately announced that 10 times the number of people who got killed were killed, and that it was the hospital that got hit rather than near the hospital, and that the explosive that hit the hospital was fired by Israel and targeted the hospital. And this was completely false, but it made the front page of the New York Times and other newspapers around the world and caused enormous damage to Israel's standing in the eyes of the world in just a few weeks after the October 7th attack. So Hamas is perfectly happy to jump in and present inaccurate information dishonestly, purposefully dishonestly, to make Israel look bad. But as I said, it will also use uh, it will also do whatever it can do that is accurate that makes Israel look bad. And when it's accurate, I mean, I don't mean to say that it's an in context, totally honest presentation, but in some cases they will show targets that the Israelis actually did hit. And without telling the whole story, they will say this shows, um, an Israeli lack of concern or purposeful targeting of civilians. And then in other cases, they make things up.
Um, Doug, we're focusing in this respect very much on the macro. I wonder if I can bring it somewhat to the micro. So the influence on world public opinion, and certainly in Israel's case, that's extremely important because it's a small country and it relies on many others in terms of imports of arms, international trade, and so turning that public opinion is pretty critical. But you'd mentioned earlier, especially in respect to the Vietnam War, the impact on domestic public opinion and what internal political pressures might be borne to bear there. I wonder, turning perhaps back to Israel, but an earlier instance of the unilateral withdrawal from southern Lebanon in the year 2000. Can you comment at all on what happened in the lead up to that June withdrawal, and whether or not we can link those sorts of internal phenomena also to lawfare, or do you see that as being something separate and purely to do with politics?
I think the example that you cited, the Israeli withdrawal in June of 2000 from southern Lebanon, was one of the signal asymmetric warfare successes of of Israel's enemies. And what happened was Israel was involved in the fighting in Lebanon for many years, and from the beginnings of the first Lebanon War in the early 1980s, all the way up to the year 2000, and Israel had established a security zone in southern Lebanon, and over time, it was quite clear to Hezbollah that they could not defeat the IDF. They couldn't actually push the Israelis out of southern Lebanon. But they could kill a few Israelis every week for years. And they did. And the consequence was that a movement was created within Israel, an anti-war movement that demanded in often in the name of the mothers of the Israeli soldiers who were being killed, demanded that Israel withdraw from southern Lebanon. And when General Ehud Barak was elected prime minister in the late 1990s, he decided that Israel should simply leave southern Lebanon. And so he made a surprise announcement in June of 2000 that Israel would leave and abandon the various Lebanese with whom it had been working. It was a quick and humiliating withdrawal by Israel, which Hamas celebrated as a great victory, and Yasser Arafat at the time praised as a great, brilliant victory. Um, and it was an example of an asymmetric strategy because Hezbollah was not trying to defeat the IDF. They were trying to, by killing a few Israelis a week for years, as I said, they were trying to get the Israeli political system to hand them a victory. And
Mhm.
that's what happened when Prime Minister Barak pulled Israel out. It is interesting that Yasser Arafat at the time made the announcement that this is something that the Palestinians can learn from. And then the withdrawal from Lebanon occurred in June of 2000. And in September of 2000, Arafat initiated what is commonly known as the Second Intifada. And I think it was pretty clearly inspired by the Hezbollah victory in southern Lebanon. And Arafat used the Palestinian Authority's security forces to perpetrate a long series of uh, attacks on Israeli buses and restaurants and other targets. And it lasted for years. It killed over 1,000 Israelis. And this was, I think, his idea of how to uh, try to get the Israelis to withdraw from territories that the Palestinian Authority was responsible for, um, is similar to what Hezbollah had done in southern Lebanon. And then, lo and behold, in the second Intifada went from 2000 to the beginning of 2005, and in 2005, while Israel crushed the second Intifada, it also announced and implemented a unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. And I think many Palestinians uh, saw that as vindicating that same Hezbollah pioneered strategy that the second Intifada had killed enough Israelis that the Israelis decided, as they had run away from southern Lebanon, they would run away from Gaza. And this gave inspiration to Israel's enemies that if they can continue to chip away at the Israelis and kill small numbers over, in a regular way over a long period of time, that the Israelis would quit. The Israelis would run away. The Israelis would make concessions.
That pattern, if you will, of perhaps withdrawal becoming inspiration for further asymmetric attempts that you've described is quite striking. I perhaps see a parallel with Hamas's remark that they believe they will win because they love martyrdom and death as much as the Israelis love life. And whether or not that also plays into the kind of dynamic when we come back to look at lawfare, rule of law countries versus non-rule of law countries and their approach to it, whether we see that also reflected in a desire to preserve life or those that oppose it.
Yes, it's the one could say that the strategy that I'm describing hinges on taking some of the best qualities of liberal democratic countries and using them against those liberal democratic countries. So one of the best qualities is the respect for life. Another one is the respect for law. And in both cases, they're using that respect as a weapon to beat their enemies with.
Well, that's a brilliant connection then, I suppose, to coming back to the concept of law and lawfare. Lots of people ask me, Doug, when I speak about these issues, what is international law? Can you give us your take on how you would describe it?
Well, I think there's a lot of misunderstanding of what international law is that comes from uh, problems with the word law. The I would say that perhaps the main misunderstanding that people in the West have, people who come from countries that really have a rule of law, that they the mistake that people in those countries make about international law is they think that international law is like domestic law. But there are two important distinctions between domestic law and international law. And there are many, but two of the most important, in my view, are number one, in a in a country that has a rule of law, there is a way to definitively know what the law is with respect to any case or controversy. You can fight a legal battle and it'll go through the courts, but it'll eventually reach a high enough court that there will be a definitive judgment of what the law is. That's very important. That doesn't exist in international law by and large. There is no equivalent of the Supreme Court. The World Court, the International Court of Justice, does not have jurisdiction over all the cases and controversies that arise in the world. It has limited jurisdiction. Basically, it depends on the consent of the parties, which means that when you have the kinds of controversies that produce war, there's virtually never consent by the parties to allow the International Court of Justice to resolve the issue. So there's no definitive statement of what the law is on important questions. The second thing that domestic law has that international law doesn't is enforcement. So that even if you can get a clear statement of what the law is, there's no one in the international context um, who is authorized to enforce the law. And so what that means is when people throw around terminology like the the Israeli settlements in the territories are illegal. And, international law says that that land belongs to the Palestinians or that the Israeli settlements are illegal.
My first question is usually which law, but
Well, when people say that, what they're actually saying is there are a number of, by and large, law professors, or international civil servants who say that it's illegal or say that the land is Palestinian. There are other international law professors and scholars and officials who say the opposite. And nobody, unless they're saying more than they actually uh, have a right to say, nobody can declare that the settlements are legal or illegal in a truly definitive fashion because it's really just one group of law professors arguing against another group of law professors. And one can have one's opinion about who makes the better argument. And various scholars have made the argument, but the idea that because the a bunch of countries, 200 or so countries in the UN General Assembly vote and say something, that means that as a matter of international law, what they said is binding. That's
mm.
just that's not true. I mean, the countries in the UN General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, first of all, is not a legal body, nor is the Security Council. Those are political bodies, not legal bodies. In the General Assembly, big countries and small countries, democratic countries and authoritarian and tyrannical countries, all have, each country has one vote. I mean, it's totally meaningless for somebody to say that because the UN General Assembly has listed, has referred in hundreds of resolutions to the West Bank as Palestinian Arab territory, that has any legal significance at all as to who has, a proper legal claim to the territory. It's just a bunch of countries, as I said, some big, some small, some democratic, some tyrannical, and it's not a legal judgment. It's just a political statement, and it has
And
no legal bearing at all. And yet, it's interesting that if you read legal documents, you will find that many people who pretend to be serious about international law will cite the hundreds and thousands of UN General Assembly resolutions labeling the West Bank as Palestinian Arab territory. They will cite those resolutions as if they are a sign or evidence of the the legal status of the territories.
that's a depressing thought that the people who claim to be most interested, and in principle perhaps should be the most committed to international law, it often seem to be those that take it the least seriously. The recent British, French, Canadian statements and commitment to recognition of Palestinian Arab statehood is part and parcel of that. Is this the sort of culmination of these sorts of lawfare practices of taking the political and dressing it up as legal? Or we've got a lot of questions about how do we address this? What's the future and what's the pushback, which I want to come on to. But is this pinnacle lawfare, or can you perhaps see it getting worse?
Well, first of all, I think you're correct that when you when you look at various governments with progressive politics around the world, those who most often will refer to international law and say that international law really matters to them, many of those governments are cynical in the way they deal with international law, and They don't actually respect the law. They use the law. They and an example of it is citing these UN General Assembly resolutions, but other examples are, for example, uh, something out of the headlines in the last week or two. You get governments that want to pressure Israel on what it's doing in Gaza by announcing that they're going to recognize a Palestinian state. Now, the Palestinians do not have a state if by the definition of a state under international law. A state has to be a a territory that is controlled by a government that has actual control, sovereign control, and sovereign meaning that they're not under somebody else's control. A government that has sovereign control over territory that has a population. Now, the Palestinians don't have that. And and so for governments like Canada or Britain or Germany or France to say that they're going to recognize something that doesn't exist is showing contempt for the international legal concept of what a state is. And I mean, it's one thing to say, as a political matter, we're going to say that we support the creation of a state for the Palestinians. It's another thing to say we recognize it. I mean,
Mm.
recognizing something that doesn't exist is a way of saying international law is nonsense. We're not in the name of international law, we're going to ignore international law, is what they're effectively saying. And and this is one of a number of examples that show how people, especially in progressive politics, who claim to really care about international law, actually have no actual respect for it.
You've mentioned a couple of them. I know in the past to me, was it Russia's substitution for the Soviet Union on the Security Council is perhaps remarkable given that
Right. Because the UN of all the institutions in the world that should be taking international law seriously, you would think the UN should be at the top of the list. And yet it's extremely interesting that when the Soviet Union collapsed, the question arose, what should be done with the Soviet Union's seat on the Security Council? Now, the UN Charter is a treaty. It's a multilateral treaty. That treaty specifically provided that there were five permanent members of the Security Council, and it named them. And those permanent members have vetoes on the Security Council. So it's a really big deal in the UN Charter who those countries are. And at the time that the Soviet Union collapsed, the countries that arose on the territory of the former Soviet Union, a subset of them initially made an agreement making it clear that neither Russia nor Ukraine nor Belarus nor uh, the other parties to the agreement claimed to be the successor to the Soviet Union. Each was just a new country arising on the territory of the Soviet Union, which had ceased to exist. And yet, at the UN, a number of UN bureaucrats, and some of them have written up this story, and there's a law review article by the people who did this. They said they looked at each other and they said, what do we do about the seat of the Soviet Union on the Security Council? And one of them said, well, let's just change the nameplate. And so they put Russia on there. And that was a major amendment of the UN Charter. And by international law, an amendment to an agreement of that kind should have been submitted to all the members uh, of the UN, and it should have been treated as an amendment that needed to be approved. And that was simply ignored. So it's yet another example of the people who were supposed to take international law seriously showing no respect for it at all.
or perhaps seeking to sidestep it in the interests of expediency. I'm pretty sure I recall you also telling me about Kennedy's reaction in seeking to blockade Cuba, being told that a blockade was an act of war, and suggesting therefore that it simply be called something else, uh,
Right.
or indeed uh, President Clinton's decision with respect to the ERA campaign over Kosovo, perhaps knowing the UN wouldn't approve of this, decided instead not to go through the UN but via NATO. Um, so is this perhaps a reflection of, the confluence of politics versus law, or is it? I appreciate that in the United States, the argument that international law doesn't exist perhaps carries more favor than in the United Kingdom. And it's something that's often presented to me if I'm in the US talking about these issues, that not much store can be set by it.
Well,
And
I want to be clear. I'm not saying that international law doesn't exist. There is such a thing as international law. I just think that calling it law is misleading. Because when people from law-abiding countries think of law, they think of something that is more definite and stronger and more enforceable than what is known as international law. I mean, there is this phenomenon of the practice of states where they feel that there are certain practices that they are obliged to enter into. For example, not killing the diplomats of other countries. I mean, there's a rule. I mean, that goes back thousands of years that if somebody wanted to conduct diplomacy, you could send a representative even to an enemy potentate, and the enemy potentate will respect the representative enough not to kill him. And so that kind of thing has been a practice for thousands of years. It's consensual, and you could argue it's international law. But but there's a lot that goes under the label of international law that is uh, that is widely misunderstood in the West, and there are all kinds of people who very cynically make arguments about what international law allows or doesn't allow, um, who are saying much more than they're really entitled to say. And so the point that I'm making is not that there's no international law, it's that you should be very suspicious when somebody invokes international law, because in many cases, all they're really referring to is the opinion of uh, law professors of a particular political persuasion.
best to ask an international lawyer then. A couple more questions from the audience, Doug, if I may. One asks, I'm wondering whether the quasi-lawfare campaigns against the US and other Western nuclear powers, which preceded the Vietnam War, were also highly significant in creating what we now call lawfare. I'm thinking of such quasi-judicial bodies as were set up by the likes of Bertrand Russell, and which were always well supported by, the question says, Marxist and far-left establishments, which began to use such terminology as war crimes, crimes against humanity, to establish proceedings which created pseudo law. Now, of course, those phrases preceded that and emerged from the collective effort to ensure never again means never again. But we haven't yet really spoken about the international legal institutions that seem to have driven much of these lawfare phenomena. What do you think about the link between the institutions themselves and that campaign?
I I, I think that the question is essentially correct, that there has been there's been an effort on the part of people who have been enemies of the West, or enemies of the United States, or enemies of Israel, to create institutions to constrain their enemies, and and to do so in the name of international law. So there were various groups, for example, that argued that America's use of nuclear weapons would be illegal. Now, an argument like that was pretty clearly not going to have any influence on the Soviet Union, but it was viewed as something that could have political resonance in the United States and could be a constraint on American action and American policy. And we saw a lot of that during, in particular, the nuclear freeze debates in the early 1980s. And so those were arguments essentially of a political nature that were couched in legal terms because they would have potency in Western countries.
Mm.
And then these ad hoc groups of the type that Bertrand Russell and others created eventually got institutionalized. So now you have things like the International Criminal Court, which I think is a terrible idea because it creates a prosecutor who doesn't answer to anybody. Um, and I mean, one of the principles of democratic government is that there have to be checks and balances. There have to be everybody who exercises official authority in a democratic country has to, in one way or another, be accountable to the voters.
So that strikes me as a useful segue into this big question of what we can do about it. If it's the accountability that is missing from this international mechanism, so many questions, Doug, that we haven't been able to get onto, but I do want to devote this last part to, projecting what can be done. But then so many questions focusing on, well, can the US, can Israel not use lawfare themselves? Do you have any immediate views on that, as well as, if that's not an option, as I don't believe it is, what might the routes to push back on this be?
Well, I, as to whether Israel could use lawfare itself, I'm not sure you need to call it lawfare. Much of the world was outraged by the murders and the rapes on October 7th, 2023. That's as much a moral argument as a legal argument. You didn't, I don't think you need to appeal to law to make people feel outraged that, women were raped and torn apart and murdered, and that all kinds of other, the men and women who were at the Nova music festival were murdered. I mean, it's a moral outrage, and it's not legal. It's not necessary to make the point in legal terms. Um, the I guess Israel could and should do a much better job than it's done on fundamental moral issues that tend to be discussed in legal terms. So, for example, there are many people, especially young people, whose idea of the Arab-Israeli conflict is that Israel stole the Arabs' land. The more sophisticated version of that is the British stole the Arabs' land and gave it to the Jews. I mean, in either case, it starts with a legal and moral concept that the land belongs to the Arabs and the Jews now have it. And that was theft or the result of theft. And therefore, anything that Israel does to defend itself is simply a defense of stolen property. So Israel is totally illegitimate in even defending itself.
But it's the historical falsehood that underpins
Right,
where.
but that is essentially a legal argument that it's a legal slash moral argument that people make that now it's an interesting thing. I mean, some of us have been talking literally for decades. I mean, for a half century, that the Israelis should do a much better job of explaining the history, educating, the world in general and even educating their own pro-Israel community about these matters
Mm.
so that this extremely simple but enormously potent argument that Israel is an illegitimate state, Israel is a state based on the theft of Arab property, and everything Israel does to defend itself is simply defending stolen property, so it's illegitimate. I mean that's a catastrophe for Israel. And if you want to ask, like, what can people do that would be helpful? In the first instance, people who are pro-Israel should educate themselves better so that when somebody throws that argument out at them, that Israel is a state because the Jews stole the Arabs' land, that they can answer that. And I mean, what's rather remarkable to me, because I've spoken to many pro-Israel groups over decades, is how few people, even people who are really devoted to Israel, are capable of handling that question when it's posed by an enemy or when it's posed by their own children who go to college and are then told these delegitimating things about Israel, and they have a hard time answering their own children. And the advice that I would give is read a book. I mean, the argument. Let me just say, the argument is fundamentally wrong. Israel does not exist on territory that belonged to the Arabs, and one could spend the next hour talking about the history and explaining why that's the case. But suffice it to say, the fundamental argument against Israel is wrong, and people who support Israel should be in a position to refute it knowledgeably. And it's not enough to have Israel in your heart. You have to have enough historical information in your head to be able to defend the cause. And whether that cause is defending America and its role in the world or Israel and its existence and role in the Middle East, you have to educate yourself to counter these arguments.
And the falsehoods in particular. I wasn't expecting quite such a robust plug for the efforts of UK Lawyers for Israel Charitable Trust to put out this kind of educational material, not just on the YouTube channel where we have discussed these issues at great length with many experts from around the world, but also on the UKLFI website with briefings and bullet points, really trying, as you say, to dispel the big myths that underpin so many of these lawfare arguments. In the last couple of minutes, Doug, I just wanted to include a couple of final questions. One, specifically, I know you mentioned China when you talked about America's success in establishing itself as the superior military power. A particular question asks about China and its particular impact or role in the international arena and utilizing lawfare. Do you have anything in particular to say about that, or indeed Russia has also been brought up by a number of people?
Well, on China, what I would say is the hottest subject that threatens war is the Chinese claim to own the South China Sea. And it's pretty clear that if and when the Chinese make a major move to seize the islands in the South China Sea in uh, in a way that could actually provoke uh, a major military reaction from the West, when the Chinese do that, they are going to be making legal arguments that they have made over the years that we know very well, that experts know very well, but the public does not know very well. And so lawfare is going to be a powerful tool for China because they're going to try to confuse the world into believing that they're merely moving into their own backyard and that what is actually an aggression is really just a domestic matter for China. And so that's an example of how China is, it can be expected to exploit lawfare. And it's not completely dissimilar to what the Russians did in Crimea when when Putin moved into Crimea in 2014. What he did was initially he sent in troops who were not wearing insignia. And the purpose of that, in part, was to make people in the West say, is this a Russian invasion, which we really should probably do something to resist? Or is it just Ukrainians who are pro-Russian acting against their own government, in which case it's an internal Ukrainian matter that we should stay out of? And Putin brilliantly exploited that predictable reaction by people in Europe so that for the first several weeks after his invasion of Crimea, you had debates over who were the people doing the action. Were they Ukrainians? Were they Russians? And by the time that got resolved, and it was pretty clear that they were Russians, the Russians were already ensconced. And it's much harder to displace an invasion force after it's ensconced than it is to block them to begin with. So that was a very clever move by Putin and was an example of exploiting lawfare for his purposes.
But I think what's clear is this inextricable link between these lawfare initiatives, the military campaigns, the misinformation war, propaganda, and the revision of history. It's all very much bundled together, and undoubtedly that's why so many of these actors have been quite so successful in deploying it. Doug, it was extremely ambitious for us to try and tackle the entire subject of lawfare in an hour. I'm sure it's something that we will, with UK Lawyers for Israel, come back to revisit with others and gather additional perspectives. I've seen a lot of people asking in respect of your question on the territory for resources. There is quite a lot of material, as I mentioned, on the UKLFI Charitable Trust YouTube channel, and we're working on more bulletins. But in particular, the principle of uti possidetis juris, which I've also been asked to address, is a key component, which I would encourage those who aren't familiar with it to look up, of what international law might universally say against how it can be misrepresented, along with that historical and false legal narrative. I'm extremely grateful for your time and your insights. Very grateful to the audience and the many, many questions, which I'm sorry we didn't manage to get through. But I look forward to continuing the discussion on another occasion. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure.